vehicles are often thought about as a luxury good for higher income individuals or higher income countries. But a new trend has emerged in the past couple of years where in the developing world, many emerging markets are adopting EVs at an unprecedented rate. So today you can see that Indonesia has a higher sales rate than the United States, and Thailand has one that's approaching that of the European Union. And this is kind of a remarkable trend that has implications for where the automotive sector is headed, for the fusion of technology, and for how policy works, understanding better how industrial policy works. My name is Ilaria Mazzocco. I'm Deputy Director and Senior Fellow with the Trustee Chair in Chinese Business and Economics at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. And today I'm joined by my colleague Ryan Featherston, Associate Fellow with the Trustee Chair at CSIS. Hi, Ryan.
Hi, Ilaria. Happy to be with you today.
Today, yeah, again, we're talking about EVs in emerging markets. But we're talking about a slightly different topic here, right?
Yeah, so I think last video we talked a lot about the role of China in global EV markets and in global EV trade. But today we're going to be talking a little bit more about the strategies that many of these countries that we're looking at right here have and how they're thinking about their own EV industries, industrial policy, supportive policy for adoption, just the different things that they're doing to influence their own markets.
Right, there's agency here, right?
Yes.
This is not just a result of Chinese exports.
Yes, no, these countries are not just passive recipients of Chinese exports and, as we'll talk about a little bit, investment, right? They're thinking really pragmatically and often very proactively about how they can increase adoption and thinking about how to transition their own industries. I know one of your favorite stats is about how many countries in the emerging world actually are automakers, even if we don't usually think of them.
Right, it's my new favorite stat. It's every middle-income country in the G20 has an automotive sector, right? So they're assembling or producing cars, which matters a lot for their economy, even though they might not rank in the top 5 producers of cars, although some do. So I think that's quite significant, something to keep in mind, that a lot of these leaders of these countries are thinking very proactively of what happens if the automotive sector and supply chains shift and the technology changes, right? Where does that leave them?
Yeah, no, and I think one thing that's important to note here is that this is looking at the sales share, right? But it is part of the reason why we miss a lot of these countries is that they tend to be quite small markets, right? So we can see here, especially compared to China, even the European Union and the United States look pretty small. This is just EV sales, right? So not total passenger vehicle sales. Yeah. But you can see Brazil, still a relatively small market. And even if we were to be looking at just total passenger vehicle sales, still a smaller market than these other larger ones, right?
Absolutely. And Brazil is one of the larger markets for passenger vehicles among emerging markets, right? So it's quite remarkable. I mean, China makes everybody look bad on this chart, and that's something we'll come back to, right, in the sort of, it's also the advantage of Chinese car makers that they have access to such a large market. My other favorite stat is 11.5 million EVs were sold in China last year, and in the European Union, the aggregate number of EVs that have been sold over the years is actually just over 12 million, right? So quite similar numbers, and I think that just gives you a sense of like the scale here. But let's move on and talk about an emerging market and talking about scale. This really sort of is the other extreme of the spectrum.
Yeah, so this is Costa Rica, and as you alluded to, it's definitely the smallest market we're going to be talking about today. You can see on the axis there, this is under 1,000 cars per month, just electric vehicles, not all passenger vehicles, but still, very small market. The remarkable thing, though, about Costa Rica is that even as a small country, it's been very proactive in thinking about how it can increase adoption. And that's led to some interesting trends when it comes to its relationship with global trade and with China in particular. So in 2019, Costa Rica actually introduced a law which eliminated tariffs and some other consumption taxes on electric vehicles. And that really has led to a persistent increase in sales of vehicles from China in particular. Can you tell me a little bit why you think that is, Ilaria? Why is it that Chinese vehicles have proven so popular in Costa Rica, even if policymakers didn't set out to import a bunch of vehicles from China?
I mean, that's essentially where all the variety of models that are affordable is really, right?
Yeah.
Even in some cases, there are some Western automakers that are exporting EVs made in China to markets like Costa Rica or even the European Union, right? So I think just that's really where the a lot of the EVs are made. And so that's where it's coming from. I mean, Costa Rica is also a very special market that consumers can actually import their own cars from wherever they think they can get the best price and the best model. Yeah. So that's driving some of this as well. But again, this is a small market, but I think it's reflective of a lot of countries around the world that don't really have a domestic industry. So they're not really engaging actively in sort of industrial policy to develop an automotive sector. But they are thinking about reasons why they may want more EVs in their country, whether it's for climate reasons or it's to reduce dependency on oil imports or some other reason, right? And so I think Costa Rica is quite interesting from that perspective. But let's talk about a bigger market. Brazil, and this chart is pretty crazy, Ryan. I think you need to walk us through it.
Yes, so I think the first thing we all notice is some pretty large spikes here in this data. So this is looking at imports from China to Brazil of EVs. So this is from the Brazilian perspective, how many passenger vehicles they're importing, except this is a little bit in value terms. So we can see here actually is a huge spike in trade in Brazil, starting around 2024 really is the bulk of it. We see these huge spikes, and this has to do a lot with Brazil's own tariff policy. So actually a while ago, I believe sometime in 2015, Brazil provided exemptions for a lot of tariffs on electric vehicles. That kind of existed for a long time, and then along came Chinese automakers. They discovered Brazil was an open market that could be a good place for them to enter and start competing. They started importing a lot of cars. And then Brazil introduced a phase-in tariff, right? So there were tariffs that phased in starting in January. You see a tiny little bump there, not as big as the others. The tariff went up to around 18% in July of 2024. So you see a huge bump of Chinese automakers exporting vehicles to Brazil in order to get in before that tariff deadline. And then, as you can expect here, the tariff also increased further here in July 2025. It's going to set to increase all the way to 35% in July of next year. But you can see these big spikes in trade are really due in part to Brazil's own policy, but also Chinese automakers thinking about how can we continue to sell to the Brazilian market at the most affordable price.
Well, and also they've been thinking more proactively about what happens in the long term, right? They've actually opened factories.
Yes, so that's kind of one of the things that's, whether or not it's intentional element of Brazilian policy, I guess it's a matter of debate. But these companies have discovered that they have a market in Brazil due to trade, right? They started off being able to sell because they were able to export. But now that there are these tariff barriers going up, these companies are now deciding, well, maybe it's a good idea to invest in Brazil so that they can maintain their market share, right, and continue to sell cars. So BYD is opened a factory that I believe is now producing
and
vehicles.
Great Wall Motors is the other one.
Yeah, so that's something where it's an interesting trend where Brazil has kind of had this strategy, maybe unintentionally, but it's ended up increasing sales and then also increasing investment from China.
Yeah, and I think let's talk about a country that actually has done this very intentionally, right? Indonesia, and it's a complicated story. We'll probably try not to spend too much time. One could have a whole video just about Indonesia, I think. But what happened here, Ryan?
Yeah, so Indonesia is almost the inverse of what we just talked about with Brazil. So you can see here that Indonesia actually removed import duties, so it removed tariffs on Chinese vehicles. That was part of a scheme that was meant to attract investment. So in order for a company to be able to export to Indonesia, they need to have commitments to investment in Indonesia. And so that was a very proactive...
That's very similar to what Thailand did, right?
Yes, yeah. And Thailand is, I think, one of the earliest examples of this strategy. And then another country, actually, that we'll talk about is considering this strategy as well. But that has led to this large increase in sales. But tell me a little bit more about the previous policy that Indonesia had tried out in order to boost its EV sales.
Yeah, so they removed VAT taxes on sales of cars that had significant local content. So you can see that led to a bit of an increase here, right? But it wasn't just not comparable to what happened after the removal of the import duties. And part of that is just that there wasn't that much choice. There were a couple of car makers that qualified for this VAT reduction, and consumers, obviously responded, but it just didn't respond at the same level. But after the removal of the tariffs, you just get an inflow of new models and often very affordable models coming in from China. But not just China, right? VinFast has also done well. VinFast is a Vietnamese automaker, and they're opening a factory in Indonesia as well. So I think that'll be quite interesting. Indonesia also has big plans for developing their own battery industry, so we'll have to see how that develops. Hyundai has partnerships for battery making in Indonesia. We'll have to see. That's going to be a really interesting process to see and see how that works out with all this Chinese investment that's coming in.
Yes, I think that's the case for both Brazil and Indonesia, right? It's just we have to see whether those companies will be able to replicate the value chain that they've had in China, right, and made them so competitive in some of these other countries. So.
Yeah, and I should say Hyundai, which did qualify for the VAT reduction, is still making a lot of cars in Indonesia, but they're exporting a lot of them. So it's still in some ways successful industrial policy, but it hasn't really translated to domestic adoption.
Yes.
Interesting stories there on Indonesia, and certainly one that I think we'll be coming back to in the future. But let's talk about a country that's closer to home.
Yeah, so this is Mexico, and right now we're looking at it from Mexico's perspective. This is actually exports from China to Mexico. One thing that's very important about Mexico, obviously, is that when we think about Mexico as an auto producer, we think mainly about the United States and its relationship with the United States. So Mexico's home to U.S. companies, German companies, Japanese automakers that have invested in the country to produce vehicles, including electric vehicles increasingly, right? But a lot of those electric vehicles, the majority of them, the vast majority of them, end up going to the United States. And so that's something that has been a little bit of a challenge for Mexico, and it's due to the kind of fluctuations in U.S. policy. Isn't that right, Ilaria?
Yeah, absolutely, right? So depending on what happens to demand in the United States, that might affect the industry in Mexico. But also, production for the United States means that a lot of Mexicans are not necessarily able to afford, or those models may not even be sold in Mexico, right?
Yes.
And so this is what we're seeing here, where a lot of models are actually imported to Mexico from China. And that's both for internal combustion engine vehicles, which includes both Chinese brands and Western brands, and then EVs, which is predominantly Chinese brands. And we talked about this in our previous videos, where viewers can go and take a look, and also our report, right? And BYD is one of the big players there in that sort of green section right there.
Yes, but Mexico's challenge will be trying to balance that. How does it help have supply that can maybe meet its own domestic needs while still maintaining access to the United States? Because, of course, that's such an important driver of growth for Mexico's industrial economy.
I would not be surprised if we see more tariffs in the coming months, especially since the USMCA renegotiation is well underway. And we should, it's going to be happening next year.
Yes, and Mexico's actually been also proactive in trying to not accept as much Chinese investment. BYD was considering a factory, and that has ended up falling through. Obviously, it could have been BYD's own decision, but I think it's safe to say Mexico was not particularly eager for that investment to happen at such a sensitive time. So.
Well, especially Mexico City, right? Local governments might be a different story. But let's talk. Let's talk about India. And we showed this chart in our previous video, but we still thought it mattered and we could talk about it from a different perspective. And that's sort of like India's strategy for how to solve this problem.
Yeah, so we talked a little bit about how India is one of the rare examples where you have Indian domestic automakers that are doing quite well. So those are Tata Motors, Mahindra & Mahindra. So those companies are doing pretty well in the Indian market, but they still rely on Chinese batteries, which is what we can see here. That a lot of vehicles, even those produced by Indian manufacturers, use batteries from companies like Gotion and BYD. But the Indian government is thinking really proactively about how to change that. So it's introduced, these production-linked incentive schemes, basically schemes that are aimed at increasing localization of supply chains within India. So they have two, one for auto components, they have another one for batteries. So that is kind of their attempt to provide some industrial policy support at specifically the areas where they see some weakness, right? Some places where there could be more local value chains in India.
Well, that's super interesting. I think we'll have to see if that works, right?
Yes, that's the open question for a lot of these, whether it's the Chinese investments in Indonesia and Brazil, whether it's India's attempts at localization. It's still a very dynamic story, and we're still waiting to see how it turns out.
Right, exactly. And this is just starting. I mean, one thing I'm watching are some of these companies that are coming out of emerging markets, right, like the Indian automakers or VinFast or TOG in Turkey, are they going to be able to sort of actually become big players on external markets and compete with Chinese automakers? I think that's going to be really interesting because ultimately, I think diversity in the market is always a good thing, and these companies could provide that diversity. But for now, as we mentioned, they're coming from relatively small markets, so they're just not benefiting from the same economies of scale that Chinese automakers are. So this is definitely going to be a really dynamic area that we'll be watching very closely, and we look forward to talking with you about in the future. If you're interested in these charts and these topics, we encourage you to look at our newest report, The Global EV Shift. You can find it on our website, csis.org. And thank you so much for watching.